Ms. Richards.
Sir, just wanted... Oh, yes, we didn't have the screen on, but we do now. Before I turn to the question of research, there's one question I've been asked to ask of Professor Kerridge before you disappear at lunchtime, which is this. What are or have been the principal differences between the approach and adherence to medical ethics between the UK and Australia, in particular with regard to the prominence given to patient autonomy?
In fact, Professor Savulescu is probably a better person to answer that question than I am, I think, because Julian's been working in the field for longer than I have and has had more experience in the UK. So I might hand that over to Julian to start with and then see if I can think of something to say.
Certainly. Professor Savulescu.
Well, I think that Australia has had a greater focus on respect for autonomy and also parental autonomy. So in the recent Charlie Gard case, where the court decided that it was in the best interests of Charlie Gard to die, despite his parents wanting to take him to the United States for experimental treatment at a world-class institution, that wouldn't have happened in Australia. I can't see that the parents' wishes in that case would have been overridden. So I think Australia is probably midway between the UK and the United States in terms of respect for autonomy and parental wishes included. So the UK is still very much based on a system of best interests and doctors' decisions about best interests and courts typically siding with doctors in those cases. So, you know, I think, as I said before, I think the UK is probably 10 to 20 years behind where a country like Australia or New Zealand is.
Professor Kerridge, anything to add?
I think I would agree with that. It's interesting. It's often said in relation to medical practice in Australia that it's somewhere between Europe and North America. In the area that I practice in haematology, we often joke that the protocols that we adopt for treatment of leukemia or bone marrow transplantation borrow from both spheres of practice, and we do tend to our decision making sort of fits clinically in between those two spheres, and I think the same is true of ethics as well. That may reflect in part differences in law also, where we fit somewhere between the UK and the United States as well. So I think there are interesting differences.
Thank you. I want to come on then to the question of research. You've emphasised in your report the importance of medical research and say that one's moral responsibilities in this area would not be served by being research averse. And I wondered if I could invite one of you to expand upon that a little.
I think the point that we were making is that although it has long been appreciated that this is an area where the potential for ethical wrongs is very real, we wouldn't want that to undermine our attempts to ensure that as broad a range of the population as possible benefits from scientifically sound, evidence-based medical practice. And what has happened in the past is sometimes our concerns about the vulnerabilities of particular groups, be that children or people with psychiatric complaints, people with learning disabilities, has meant that we haven't found ways of doing scientifically and ethically robust research. And we sometimes, in relation to children, use the term therapeutic orphans because much of what we do, it has not been tested in a context where it would specifically relate to children and their bodies and their situations. So I think what we're saying is we're behind the research agenda. We see the benefits that follow both individually and for society as a whole. And the challenge is to find ways methodologically, scientifically and ethically to do that in the best way possible. And part of that project is moving away from the idea that you do research on people to an idea of conducting research with people, so that your participants have influence on the research agenda, advise on the development of protocols, and actually feel as if they're part of a societally beneficial enterprise, rather than, to use the very pejorative term that has been used in the past, human guinea pigs.
And
I think there's a moral obligation to take part in research, because we all stand on the shoulders of people who have contributed to or made sacrifices through past research. That doesn't mean that unreasonably risky research should go ahead, or people should be forced to take part in research without their consent. But there is a general obligation to contribute to ongoing benefit, just as we've benefited from the enormous amounts of research that enabled us to have generally unparalleled lives.
is it fair? Sorry, yes.
Yeah, no, just saying, I think these are important points, and they might seem a little trite in some ways, but it's important for us as a group of people working in ethics and law to say that we think researchers are good, because ethics, for a number of decades has worked to actually make things worse and to exclude some groups of participants from research. Now, I don't mean make things worse generally, but this particular problem of being so concerned with the vulnerability of particular populations or the potential harms of research that ethically it seemed that the right thing to do was exclude that population or subpopulation from research entirely. So as Bobby mentioned, children, people at the end of life, people in acute emergencies, people in intensive care units, people with dementia, people with end-stage neurological disorders, pregnant women, fetuses. I mean, there's an enormous number of populations who have been neglected from the benefits of research and advances in medical progress because of an ethical concern about their vulnerability and the possibility of harm. So it's important for us to say researchers are good, and there's an ethically robust reason to support research and to come up with ways that can encourage participation.
Is it fair to say that the importance, the value of research to society it's enhanced rather than undermined by undertaking research in an ethical and moral way?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've identified in your report 2 basic ethical principles to protect participants in research. The idea of reasonable risk and then informed consent. And I wanted to ask you about each of those in turn, starting with the issue in relation to reasonable risk. I don't know who would like to assist our understanding.
I've introduced that term, so maybe I should say what I mean by that. So protections for research grew out of the Nazi experiments and the Holocaust and the Nuremberg Code, and the idea was that participants should not be harmed by taking part in research. But most research, particularly clinical research, involves risks. And you can't say for sure that somebody won't be harmed. What you expect is that, first of all, the risks are as small as possible, given the goals, that they're minimised, that you've done enough preparatory work, for example, in animal models or through computer modelling or epidemiological research before you move to exposing human beings to risks. And then the risks are proportionate to the benefits, either to that individual, if it's a therapeutic trial, or to other people in society. So there's a proportionality between the benefits and risks. So the idea is that ethics committees an ethics review needs to ensure that certain features of the risk are taken into account. So sometimes you'll hear that the risks of research shouldn't be greater than ordinary life. That may apply to so-called non-therapeutic research with no possible benefit to the patient. But it doesn't apply for example, in Ian's field, where people are, dying of leukemia or of other blood cancers, where you can entertain much higher risks given that the alternative is death. So it requires a nuanced ethical assessment of risk, and then secondly, the presentation of that risk to the patient so they can make their decision about whether to take on those risks for either the benefit of themselves or to other people.
Is there any further reflection on that issue before I ask about informed consent in the context of research?
No, I think that's really well articulated.
Likewise, yeah.
So can I ask you next then about the second prominent factor ethically in relation to participation in research, which is informed consent, and ask you to we've obviously talked through the principles of informed consent in general terms and in relation to treatment, but if I could ask you to tell us about informed consent in the context of participation in research and what that entails.
Could I just ask, are you asking that as a sort of legally focused question or more ethically focused question?
At this stage, ethically, I'm going to ask you to look at the Declaration of Helsinki in a few minutes, but just in terms of the general ethical approach.
I can, again, if you want me to start, it again is fairly straightforward. As with any consent, people need to know what the alternatives are to participation, and what the risks and benefits of participation and non-participation are, and what their probabilities are. So they need to be able to understand what will happen to them, or what is likely to happen to them, or what could happen to them, both in terms of the risks and benefits, both of taking part and not taking part. They also will need to be informed of the broader context of the research. So, for example, what might be the implications for other people in society, what's the financial structure of the research, how will it be commercialised. Those features people may have particular values about. But in general, the same principles that apply in terms of respect for autonomy in clinical care apply in research. People need to understand what it is that they're doing, what their options are, and what the risks and benefits of those options are.
There are some important qualifications, though, and I'd agree with Julian that the basic principles of consent are the same, whether it's in clinical practice or in this research setting. But there are things that need to be emphasised in that consent process in the research setting. The first one, obviously, is that this is research and it's not clinical practice. It's not care. So the primary purpose here is the generation of new knowledge or scientific knowledge. The purpose is not to benefit the research participant or the patient if they're both. And that we know that that's important because there's a thing called therapeutic misconception, which is where people participate in research studies, in clinical studies at least, believing that they will benefit from this piece of research. And furthermore, that they won't be harmed. Others may be harmed and others may not get benefit, but they won't be. They will get benefit and they will not be harmed. And that's a genuinely difficult problem in the research setting and a difficult problem for consent. The second is the notion of scientific merit. So there's an emphasis here on what the research question is and what the research purpose is. The third is the notion of uncertainty, because uncertainty is unquestionably higher in the research setting. And indeed, if there was no uncertainty, there shouldn't be that research taking place. It starts to look like audit or starts to look like just unnecessary duplication of effort. And the fourth, I think, then is the role and the skills and the integrity of the researchers themselves. And this is something that was acknowledged in Nuremberg and subsequently in Helsinki and so forth, is that do these people know what they're doing? Have they done research before? Can they give some type of guarantee that the process of research will be followed through to its endpoint? So I think there are things in research or in consent for research that are emphasised more than they are in clinical practice.
I would agree. And on that final point of the role of the researcher, I think it's particularly important for patients who become involved in research run by their own clinicians to understand that that individual or that team will now be wearing two slightly different hats. And whilst the first will be very much focused on the best interest of the patient, and that thought isn't abandoned when they become engaged in a research process, there might well be things that the clinician can no longer do because of the constraints of the scientific protocol. And the scientific protocol is designed to get the best possible results from the research rather than to necessarily fit with the needs of a particular patient. So, for example, if a trial entails randomization between two treatments, one of which we hope is an established beneficial treatment, the other the new agent, it is not probably in the control of the clinician to decide which treatment will be given to their patient in the same way as it ordinarily would be. Similarly, to avoid bias, it might be the case that a clinician themselves is unaware of exactly what is being administered to their patient. It'll be one of two things, but they don't know which. So I think one of the things one has to explain to patients is how there will be that slight shift in the emphasis of the activities of the treating clinician, who will always keep their basic interests at heart and would hopefully never sign up to be part of a clinical trial that they didn't feel ethically confident in, but they have slightly different responsibilities when wearing their researcher's hat.
Professor
There
Kay?
is
Sorry.
one other thing that I think that follows on from what Ian was saying and yesterday. Some people will enter clinical trials in order to access a new intervention, particularly when they have a serious condition. It's a part of informed consent, both in clinical care and research trials, to tell people all of their options and indeed whether that intervention can be accessed through some other route, which he discussed yesterday, either paying for themselves or through compassionate release. So it wouldn't be enough just to describe the options of participation in this trial or not getting the treatment. It would be necessary also to discuss what other options are available if the person is really to give informed consent to take part in that sort of trial.
Right.
But one of the other responsibilities we sometimes discuss is to explain the position of equipoise to the patient, because there is this attraction with the new, but the very fact that it is subject to research is because we don't as yet know everything about this new treatment, and things might emerge that show that it isn't as promising, and it might have greater side effects, it might not have as good effects. So a clinician also needs, to some extent, to counter the rush to the new until we have a building evidence base to suggest that it is in fact a sound alternative to the standard treatment that is currently offered.
And your report emphasises the particular importance of voluntariness, the patient voluntarily participating in research, and the particular problems that can arise in the context of an existing clinician-patient relationship, where there is the risk of coercion or a sense that the patient might feel that they owe it to the clinician or participate through a sense of gratitude. How best are those ethical problems addressed?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is voluntariness is a problem. I mean, it's a feature of consent legally and ethically, and it's an issue in clinical practice, and it's also an issue in research. I think a better way to think of it is sufficiently voluntary or sufficiently free, rather than completely voluntary and completely free, because I would suggest that when someone is unwell, when they're in hospital, when they're in a whole series of relationships where power is not equally shared, and when they're in desperate need, is that they won't be sufficient, or they won't be completely free, and they won't be uncoerced by things that are part of normal life, whether they're relationships or a need to obtain assistance from people. The ways that we deal with that are through the consent process, particularly through time, through giving the opportunity to withdraw, and through doing the kinds of things that Julian and Bobby are talking about, which is explaining very clearly to people the alternatives to participation in research. And finally, I think it's the promise, particularly if, as Bobby mentioned, it's the clinician who is also a researcher, the promise, which can be made very explicitly, that their best interests will always be paramount. And so if the clinician believes that at any time the right thing to do is to withdraw from the study, then they should also be saying, okay, I really think you should not be in this study at this point, or pursuing this study is working against your best interests. I would suggest that you withdraw from it. They're the kinds of things that I think protect against coercion.
I would add a couple of things to that. I used to chair the Department of Human Services Ethics Committee in Victoria. So if a proposal like this came to me, what I would want to make sure is there are structures in place to ensure that care wasn't affected. I would also want somebody other than the clinician, the caring clinician, to be obtaining consent and possibly assigning a patient advocate to partner with the patient to ensure there wasn't any coercion. So I think there are specific things you can do to take account of this, but creating as much of an arm's length relationship in the research part of the relationship would minimise the effects of the potential effects of pressure or influence or even coercion.
I'm going to ask you to look at the Declaration of Helsinki with me. It was, I think, first promulgated in 1964 and then revised in 1975. I'm not going to ask you to go through the various iterations of it, but for the purpose of asking you to comment on it, I'm going to go to the 1975 text as set out in the BMA's Ethics Handbook in 1980. So if we could have on screen, please, Shomik, BMAL 5087. I'm going to ask you to look first at the text of the handbook. Shomik, it's numbered page 24. Which may correspond to the electronic page. I'm not sure at the moment. Now, if we go back 2 pages, please. And if we look at the bottom of the page, we see the heading Research in Human Subjects. The third form of contact with doctors occurs in the field of research. The law lays down a minimum code in matters of, top of the next page, professional negligence and the doctrine of assault, but this is not enough. Most patients trust their doctors and will consent to any proposal. Experimental procedures are nearly always too technical for patients or non-experts to understand. For practical purposes, therefore, the doctor concerned carries a moral responsibility for the investigations that are or are not proposed to his patient or volunteer. Medical advances have always depended upon the public's confidence in those who carry out investigations on human subjects. This confidence will be maintained only if the public believes that such investigations are submitted to rigorous ethical scrutiny and self-discipline. It is unethical to conduct research which is badly planned or poorly executed. Codes, regulations and laws help to keep standards of ethical behaviour high, but volunteers and patients are best protected by ethical conduct. The subject's interests must come first. And then there's a discussion about controlled clinical trials. In paragraph 4.4, consent, this is the fourth line, must always be obtained from the individual subjects. And 4.5, because of the ethical problems which may arise, controlled clinical trials should always be approved and supervised by a properly constituted ethical committee. Any doctor must remain free to remove a patient from under his care from such a trial, or give additional treatment at any time if he feels it to be in the patient's best interest. Any patient must also remain free to withdraw from such a trial. And then it goes on to talk about research on children, which I'll come back to. Just before we look then at the text of the Declaration of Helsinki, which is set out in this handbook, are there any observations or comments that you have on those passages of the handbook?
I would agree with almost everything that's said there, except for the sentence that says that patients and non-experts can't understand experimental procedures. I think they can. I think it just takes time and effort and proper communication process to make sure that they can understand them. The rest, for me, I think is ethically very, very appropriate and broadly accepted.
I think another empirical assumption that's outdated is that everyone will agree to participate in research if suggested to them by their doctor. If you look at the challenges that some incredibly well-designed, important clinical trials face in terms of recruitment these days, there are many reasons why people might choose not to be part of a clinical trial or some form of medical research.
Another thing to point out is that the guide refers to research subjects, and there's a preference today to term it participants, because the idea is that they are consenting individuals that agree to participate in something rather than have something done to them. And this flows from the principles that I think Ian in particular was talking about yesterday of treating people as an end in themselves rather than as a means to an end.
Dr. Kazarian? We can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Sorry. I agree. I think I would agree with everything that's said in this text. And apart from the fact that participants were called subjects at that time, and now the model is more participatory and more collaborative with people. And that's an important point, but I think we can explore that further later.
And then if we go then to the text of the Declaration of Helsinki as revised in 1975, Seamus, it's page 59 of the numbered pagination. So it may be 57 electronically. Go back one page, thank you. We can pick it up at the bottom of the page under the heading Human Experimentation. In 1964, the World Medical Association drew up a code of ethics on human experimentation. This code, known as the Declaration of Helsinki, was revised in 1975 as follows. And then if we go to the next page, it's the mission of the medical doctor to safeguard the health of the people. His or her knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this mission. The Declaration of Geneva of the World Medical Association binds the doctor with the words, "The health of my patient will be my first consideration." The International Code of Medical Ethics declares that any act or advice which could weaken physical or mental resistance of a human being may be used only in his interest. The purpose of biochemical research involving human subjects must be to improve diagnostic, therapeutic and prophylactic procedures and the understanding of the etiology and pathogenesis of disease, etc. In current medical practice, most procedures involve hazards. This applies a fortiori to biomedical research. Medical progress is based on research which ultimately must rest in part on experimentation involving human subjects. And then this, which I'm going to ask you to comment on in a moment. In the field of biochemical research, a fundamental distinction must be recognised between biomedical research, in which the aim is essentially diagnostic or therapeutic for a patient, and medical research, the essential object of which is purely scientific and without direct diagnostic or therapeutic value to the person subjected to the research. And then we see some principles then set out starting at the bottom of the page. But if we could go over to the next page. So we see paragraph 2 is about the need for a protocol and an independent committee. Paragraph 3 about research being conducted only by scientifically qualified persons under the supervision of a clinically competent medical person. And then 4 is the proportionality of objective and risk. 5, the need for a prior careful assessment of predictable risks in comparison with foreseeable benefits. Concern for the interests of the subject must always prevail over the interests of science and society. 6, right of the research subject to safeguard his or her integrity must always be respected. 7, doctors should abstain from engaging in research projects involving human subjects unless satisfied that the hazards involved are believed to be predictable, should cease any investigation if the hazards are found to outweigh the potential benefits. 8 is concerned with accuracy of results. And then 9, in terms of informed consent, each potential subject must be adequately informed of the aims, methods, anticipated benefits and possible potential hazards of the study and the discomfort it may entail. He or she should be informed that he or she is at liberty to abstain from participation in the study and that he or she is free to withdraw his or her consent to participation at any time. The doctor should then obtain the subject's freely given informed consent, preferably in writing. And then paragraph 10, if we go over the page, talks about the particular difficulties if the patient, the subject, is in a dependent relationship to the doctor or may consent under duress. In that case, the informed consent should be obtained by a doctor who's not engaged in the investigation and who's completely independent of this official relationship. And then 11, in the case of legal incompetence, informed consent should be obtained from the legal guardian in accordance with national legislation. And 12, the research protocol should always contain a statement of the ethical considerations involved and should indicate that the principles enunciated in the present declaration are complied with. And then before we go on to look at the distinction between clinical research and non-clinical biomedical research in the following paragraphs, can I ask for any observations or comments you have upon this code?
Sorry.
It's just a very quick one. It's very recognisable to us, and much of the information that they set out as important would now be offered to patients by the form of a participant information sheet. So it would be very clearly stated and carefully written. But I do note that one of the very standard phrases that you could probably never escape putting on such a form is that you have the right to withdraw and that this will have no implications for your future care. Because if you think about this idea of feeling beholden or having a close relationship, the right to refuse may feel somewhat perilous, particularly if you feel it's then going to have an impact on the care that you receive in the future. So we make that very specific now.
Professor Savulescu?
In general, I think it's all generally correct except for one major error, which I think has subsequently been corrected, but it is quite an important error. Where it says the interests of the subject should always take precedence over the interests of society, and the health of the patient must always be the primary consideration, that's simply incorrect when it comes to research in the following way. So when you conduct a randomised controlled trial, as Bobby said, it's only ethical if you begin with what's called equipoise. That is, you have no reason to believe that the new intervention is better or worse than the existing intervention. Okay, so you're completely indifferent. But as soon as you start to obtain data, equipoise will be disturbed. So after 100 patients, you might have, a belief that the difference could only have arisen with a 5% chance. After 10,000 patients, you might be much more confident that the new intervention is better, and there's only a 1 in 10,000 chance that it arose by chance. So the more patients you accrue, the higher your level of confidence that there really is a difference. But from the patient's perspective, after 50 patients, there's going to be information about whether there's a difference. And trials never finish, large clinical trials never finish with what's called a p-value of 5% or 1 in 20. They continue to have a confidence of 1 in 10,000 that there's no error, because we want to maximise the benefits to other people in society. We want to minimise the chance that a new intervention is put on the market with side effects. But from the patient's perspective, trials would be better ending much earlier. And that's why I said you can't have this principle of no harm. You have to say that the risk is reasonable. In this case, the risk is reasonable not because it's good for the patient, but because it's good for others in society and future patients. And that's a critical thing in research, that it's simply not true that in large clinical trials, the interest of your patient is paramount. It's the interest of other people that is paramount, and that can be reasonable, provided that the patient isn't exposed to too great a risk, or that the benefits to other people are significantly large enough. But that is an important error in this declaration that persisted for decades.
I absolutely agree with your challenge, but historically you can see why there was that emphasis, because it goes back to your point yesterday about not using people merely as means to ends. And perhaps what should have been made more explicit is you have to keep in mind the best interests of your patients, and, as was previously said, withdraw them from the trial at the point at which you feel that it is very significantly counter to those best interests. So you're not simply going to stick with your patient being part of research irrespective of the impact on them. You are going to be minded to keep that in your head. But I agree with you absolutely. Whilst they remain in the trial, the priority is doing those things that add to the benefit of the trial being completed in a scientifically robust manner. But it may well be that there are patients for whom the deprivations or the burdens of a particular trial or experiment clearly run counter to their best interests. And if you were their clinician, would you not consider the issue of withdrawing them from the trial?
Well, to give an example, in one of the most famous trials in the 1980s, the ISIS-2 trial of streptokinase, the UK recruited roughly 10,000 patients to that trial. After 1,000 or so patients, Richard Dole from the Data Monitoring Committee said they had already reached their statistical endpoints for significance, but they were going to continue to recruit patients. They couldn't recruit patients in the US to this trial because US doctors just didn't believe getting a placebo was justified given the evidence. But those patients, and I calculated that something like 230 patients extra died after the Data Monitoring Committee itself had said they'd reached their statistical endpoints. And that was an example of using patients to achieve greater levels of certainty. The argument was we need to convince clinicians to change their practice. We need very high levels of certainty. And that simply didn't operate in the US, where they said, it's not in my patient's interest to get a placebo. And in fact, even before the trial started, meta-analyses showed that streptokinase was superior to placebo. So that's, there are cases where patients are recruited and when it's not in their interests. And I think you need to be honest with people about what the research is, what the levels of certainty are at the beginning of it, and what their options are.
Professor Kane.
And it's just on that, I mean, the point of certainty about whether something works or does not work, and the point of certainty about whether a particular adverse effect occurs or does not occur, and I might point that out, that they're two different outcome measures, and they won't necessarily always map on at the same time. That will differ depending upon the context, and it will differ depending upon the availability of other treatment alternatives, and it'll differ depending upon the severity of illness and the severity of adverse events from the new intervention. So if, for example, we are testing a statin, so a cholesterol-lowering drug, we already have 20 other cholesterol-lowering drugs on the market, all of which have relatively predictable side effects. The level of certainty that we will want to show that is better than all of the alternatives and is deserving of market access, for example, will be enormously high. So we will want to test many thousands of people before we actually bring that trial to a conclusion. If, on the other hand, we're faced with something like a global pandemic, we'll accept significantly lower levels of evidence before we actually draw a trial to a conclusion. We cease the trial, we produce the drug or the vaccine and make it accessible. We saw that with swine flu, we're seeing it now with COVID-19. In situations where there's a disease that affects children, where there's no alternative agents, again, we will actually accept much lower levels of certainty, much less than 5%, in fact, before we actually draw a trial to a conclusion and make it available. What we do now, though, is that we continue to gain evidence through what's called real-world data collection or phase 5 data analysis, where we look at data after a product is available or after a product is on the market, and we continue to get information about it. Sufficient information that sometimes we may then at some point in the future choose to withdraw that drug or withdraw that vaccine or cease subsidisation of it. So we can actually adjust it depending upon the circumstances.
Professor Cave.
Just two additional points. One, that the BMA is incorporating the Helsinki guidance within its wider guidance, I think is noteworthy. It shows that it recognises the broad relevance and the importance of ensuring that doctors are aware of the declaration. And secondly, the focus for the first time, I think, on disclosing risks and benefits is also noteworthy. So we've seen that it took far longer for the same principle to be recognised in law and guidance in relation to clinical treatment.
Dr. Kazarian.
Maybe just a quick comment about the issue of informed consent and the points that we made earlier. I think what's important to note from this text is also that if there is an issue with duress or the participant feels that there is a dependent relationship with the clinician, then the informed consent should be obtained by an independent person. And I think that's an important feature of that declaration as well.
And then if we could look at the next two sections of the document.
May I
yes.
just ask a question here? This is about the freedom to withdraw without, you tell me, without having any prejudice to the future treatment of the individual. And suppose you have a trial which involves administering a drug on one hand, which is something like benzodiazepine, or that in tobacco, which is chemically addictive, compared to the placebo. It might be very difficult, mightn't it, in practical terms, to actually stop. And the example could be perhaps multiplied to cases where blood products sourced from humans are used. Part of the idea may be to limit risk and to improve products, but it might be said that shifting from one to another, going back to the old treatment, may come with increased risk of health to the subject. How does that actually affect the concept of freedom to withdraw?
So Brian, I mean, the way I think about freedom to withdraw is the freedom to continue to access healthcare. Because you're right, is that if you withdraw after you've received a product, let's say has got a half-life of weeks or an impact on the immune system of 6 months or a year or 18 months or so forth. Withdrawing after you've received that product will still give you the adverse events well beyond the point of your withdrawal. So you may still be harmed, but the important thing is that person is able still to access the type of care that they need for their condition, but also for the adverse events suffered as a consequence of the trial, and that they're not prejudiced in terms of the healthcare they receive by withdrawal.
But I think Sir Brian's point is could they access the product, the superior product, outside of the clinical trial? And there is a concept now, which is only very recent, of post-trial access to people for medical care that is not standardly available, but that they received during the trial, that they have a right to continue to receive not just ordinary care, but best possible care, given their contribution to research. And is that your question, whether they should continue to be able to access outside of the trial that which they received in the trial?
That's where it leads, yes.
No.
Well, that was not standardly a part of research. You reverted to whatever the best clinical care was at the time. But since probably the 1990s and early 2000s, where trials of AZT were done in Africa, and people were then stopped from receiving that treatment once the trial finished, there emerged a view that people should continue to receive that level of care, even if it wasn't standardly available in that place at that time. So I think best practice would say, or the best ethical standards would say, yes, you should be able to receive that high level of care, but that wasn't available for many decades.
I think I heard Sir Brian's question slightly differently, which was a question around the practicalities of withdrawing from the trial and what might be entailed in terms of side effects or risks of prematurely ending the procedures that are involved in the trial. And I think if there were any risk of that, it would have to be included in the information provided. That withdrawal from the trial would need to be carefully managed and would be managed by the team involved in the research to ensure that the patient came to no harm. And on the question of post-trial benefits, I think it's a huge issue globally. And I suppose there's the issue of reciprocity, and it's usually framed that one would receive those benefits having been a participant in the whole trial, and after the trial has collected the results it needs. Are you saying that you can withdraw from the trial and still benefit from receiving a treatment you would not otherwise be able to access?
I'm going to ask you to look at the two types of research that are then described in the text of the Declaration. So we see, first of all, medical research combined with professional care, which is termed here clinical research. It says a doctor must be free to use a new diagnostic and therapeutic measure if, in his or her judgment, it offers hope of saving life, re-establishing health, or alleviating suffering. The potential benefits, hazards, and discomfort of a new method should be weighed against the advantages of the best current diagnostic and therapeutic methods. In any medical study, every patient should be assured of the best proven diagnostic and therapeutic method. Refusal of the patient to participate in a study must never interfere with the doctor-patient relationship. If the doctor considers it essential not to obtain informed consent, the specific reasons for this proposal should be stated in the experimental protocol for transmission to the independent committee. The doctor can combine medical research with professional care, the objective being the acquisition of new medical knowledge only to the extent that medical research is justified by its potential diagnostic or therapeutic value for the patient. I'll come back to that in a moment, but we can see it's contrasted with non-therapeutic biomedical research involving human subjects. And if we just go over the page, we can see briefly what's set out at the top of the page in relation to that. Duty of the doctor to remain the protector of the life and health of that person on whom biomedical research is being carried out. The subject should be volunteers, either healthy persons or patients for whom the experimental design is not related to the patient's illness. Investigators should discontinue if it may be harmful to the individual. The interests of society, science and society should never take precedence over considerations related to the well-being of the subject. So could we go back to the previous page, please, Shomik? Can I ask you to assist us in understanding what the Declaration is telling us about what it terms clinical research, medical research combined with professional care? What was that in allowing the clinician to do, and how? Professor Cave.
So today it's much clearer that innovation with respect to an individual patient might be possible. So tweaking a treatment, doing something that has the best interests of that patient in mind, even if it isn't something that is standard, might be acceptable. And that research is any investigation in man or woman designed to develop knowledge. But that distinction was previously much less clear. And we see that in the 1970 in this particular, the 1975 version of the Declaration of Helsinki, where if the research also combined medical treatment, then it was seen as something else, as not necessarily to be viewed as research. And this was something that continued really for some time. And I can give you an example from Margaret Brazier's Medicine, Patients in the Law, her textbook from 1987. She talks about the case of Mrs. Wigley. And Mrs. Wigley died when a trial drug was given to her without her knowledge and without her consent, but having been approved by 11 separate local research ethics committees. And they proceeded on the basis that consent to the surgery that she'd given also included consent to some of the drugs after surgery, including one that was experimental. And this, in turn, flowed from a lack of clarity in the Declaration of Helsinki and other guidance, which distinguished between therapeutic and non-therapeutic trials, and said that consent wasn't necessarily essential in therapeutic research, so long as the Research Ethics Committee had approved it. And this was one of the cases that sort of led to a challenge to that distinction. And it's one that we don't tend to use today. We don't tend to see this distinction between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research.
I think the critical clause is number 3, that says every patient, including those of the control group, should be assured of the best proven diagnostic and therapeutic method. So the idea of this section is that when it comes to clinical research, clinical care should not in any way be compromised or shortcutted in order to allow research to occur. And so the problem here is placebo controls, where a patient may be taken off or not offered something that would benefit them in order for a placebo-controlled trial to occur. And what this is saying is you can't do that. You have to ensure that people receive the best medical care in addition to taking part in research. Research can never compromise clinical care. But in fact, that happened, and I've written on that well into the 1990s, where people were placed on placebo-controlled trials for antibiotics after, say, caesarean section, where it had been proven that antibiotics were effective. So half of those patients were denied a proven therapeutic method. So I think the important point here is that you should not receive anything other than best standard clinical care if you're a part of a research project.
Professor Phosphides.
I think you have to acknowledge, though, that the constraints of a study may mean that you cannot avail of all the possible supportive measures that might be in place. This is a particularly true of people in end-of-life care, where additional visits to hospital might deprive them of the possibility of spending time at home or in the hospice being cared for there. There's a sense in which participation brings hoped for benefits, but it can at times be burdensome in ways that you've agreed to and understood, and in ways that have been minimised, but they do mean that the way in which you're cared for necessarily has to be adjusted in order to accommodate the trial. So, for example, if there were a counter-indication between a drug that you might be offered for pain relief and the drug that you are being given in the context of the trial, that could be problematic and challenging to ensure that you get the best possible care whilst also remaining true to the commitment that has been made to the trial.
And can I ask you to look at paragraph 5 of this? It says, if the doctor considers it essential not to obtain informed consent. Now, the one reading of that may be that the normal expectation would be, in relation to the clinical research being described here, that for all the reasons we've discussed, the informed consent should be obtained. What could be the circumstances in which a doctor could ethically conclude that it was essential not to obtain informed consent?
Well, the standard example is emergency medicine research, where the person comes in needing urgent medical treatment, and there have been studies where that application of the intervention has been delayed by several hours while consent's been sought from family members or third parties, and that's led to harm to the patient. That would be one case where it's essential not to obtain informed consent because it's an urgent clinical trial. For example, tranexamic acid and stroke would be an example of that sort of research.
Yeah, as Julian mentions, the classical one from the last few years was urgent neurosurgical interventions, where there was delays in getting research participants into surgery or getting them into neurosurgical interventions, specifically because of delays around informed consent. So there may be situations where that's done. The key part here, though, is the second part of the sentence, which is that if there's a decision to not get informed consent, that has to be absolutely clearly specified and justified. Can't be assumed by the researchers.
And there will have been a lot of prior work ahead of that decision, both Absolutely. In terms of the research and clinical teams involved and the ethics committees who have approved the study, because it will be seen as a significant departure from normal practice that is justified because of the urgent requirement to move forward.
Can I then ask, if we can take that down for now, Shomek, can I ask about any particular ethical dimensions or issues or problems that arise in relation to research on children? Professor Phosphides?
I feel I should come in here, having chaired the Nuffield Council on Bioethics working group on research involving children, and you'll probably have to stop me talking for too long. We've already alluded to the moral imperative I think we have to increase our knowledge and our evidence base pertaining to the medical treatment of children, and some of the advances that we have seen in the last century, particularly in paediatric oncology, have been precisely because bold clinicians found ways to work with children and their families to combine rigorous research and therapeutic treatments. We know that we can safely conduct research in paediatric settings, but we also know that it is challenging, that we have to be particularly mindful of the ways in which children and their parents can be made to feel very vulnerable, first of all by the onset of an illness or by the birth of a child that has multiple medical problems, but then also by the nature of entering into a medical environment, the urgency that's often entailed in getting treatment started. The challenges are significant. And then we combine with that some of the issues we discussed yesterday about capacity and the ability to consent, and what to do in those situations where we have to say that someone does not have the ability to consent. How are we going to proceed ethically in doing something to them, which will almost inevitably be the case without their consent? Are we going to feel satisfied by involving them as best we can and maybe looking for children's assent? What weight do we give to parents' consent? So there are many, many issues, and we've talked about the need to ensure a child's open future. That has an impact on how we think about any of the risks associated with participation in research, but of course it would also speak to the risks of not being involved in research and care in relation to their particular condition, not thereby advancing. So my sort of mantra is that we have to do research, but we wish to conduct, as I said earlier this morning, we wish to conduct research with children, not on children. And we've increasingly got incredible examples of the extent to which very young people, children, can contribute to our understanding of what in our report we discussed will be seen as a fair offer, something that we can put to children and their families as a proposition to be involved in research at a time that is already incredibly stressful, incredibly difficult, and at a time when they're burdened with information about diagnostics, therapeutics, but it can be done, and I think we have a very strong commitment to do it.
And I think you've told us in your report that... Oh, yes, carry on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just if I could add to that, I mean, research involving children is difficult, in part because children don't stay children forever. They grow up, they gain capacity, they gain the capacity including to provide consent for research. And this is particularly an issue for longitudinal studies, and longitudinal, particularly large epidemiological studies, are enormously important in the study of chronic diseases, including infectious diseases, including those from blood, malignancy, range of conditions where studies may start with children, where their decisions are made for them by their parents. They then will become adolescents and young adults. They'll move through periods of being mature minors and to the point where they're adults themselves, and their goals and values may change during the course of that development. Reassuringly, during that same time, of course, their parents are losing capacity, which is sad but true. So this undoubtedly adds an additional issue of complexity to research involving children. The other issue with children, of course, and Bobby talked about this in relation to relational autonomy yesterday, is that children are not they're not independent agents. They're part of families. They have siblings. They have relationships with their parents. The disease that one child gets inevitably has impacts upon the family unit, and taking all of those things into account when trying to make a best interests determination for a single child can be particularly challenging. So all of these things can be dealt with, but they do make it complex.
Absolutely, and I think the thing to say is that when we look at that complexity, and we must never forget that it's there, and where we look at the potential for vulnerability, we see it as an amber light, it's a warning light, it's not a red light, it's not a stop light, because we have got to improve.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your report's drawn attention to guidance from the BMA in 1981. I won't put it on screen, but you've identified 3 points from that 1981 guidance in relation to research on children. Is this a project that can only be carried out with the use of children? Requirements for informed consent should be particularly stringent in relation to children under the age of 10. And then a requirement that local ethical committee approval should be obtained. Do those observations reflect more generally the ethical concerns that have always been held about research on children?
I think there's some of the concerns, and to some extent they persist. We now have a very well supported research ethics committee structure in the UK, but one of the findings and subsequent recommendations of our report was that there should be more expertise embedded within those committees, specifically about paediatric medicine. So you can have a committee that does not include anybody either with lived experience of going through trials or as a child, or any specialist nurses or doctors who have cared for those individuals. So having a structure of ethics committees we think is a very good start, but you then have to look at what is the relevant expertise to properly judge the risks and benefits when talking about research involving children.
You've referred in your report to some 1984 guidance from the Royal College of Physicians of London on the practice of ethics committees, September 1984. I can put it up on screen if required, but I really want to ask you some more general questions about ethics committees. In broad terms, what is the function of an ethics committee, and how does it operate? And has that changed significantly from the late 70s or 1980s to the present day?
So the function is broadly to subject the research protocol to independent scrutiny. So a group of people, the constitution of ethics committees has changed over time, but generally there must be lay people on it, as well as researchers that will understand the science and people that will understand the ethics. And the idea is to scrutinise it to see whether it should be given approval. But things have changed vastly over time. We now have an organised, supported system, but that's been relatively recent occurrence. The Royal College of Physicians called for research ethics committees to be set up from the 1960s, but there were few and far between. And even when it was recommended that local research ethics committees were formed, so that there was one in every district health authority from about the mid-1970s, they were inconsistent in terms of their form and their constitution and what it is that they were supposed to do. So that if there was research conducted across a number of different district health authorities, you might get three very different answers from the research ethics committees. It was only really when training was established and set out from about the year 2000, and when multi-centre research ethics committees were introduced and better guidance starting in 1991, but then some additional guidance in 1997, that we got a smoother operating system that had greater consistency with regards to what they did, their constitution, their form. And interestingly, we're seeing a fairly similar thing happen with regards to clinical ethics committees today. So we've had guidance from the GMC saying they should be set up, and with regards to COVID, recommendations that things go before them, but very little information about how they should be supported or structured or who should be on them. So yes, it's something that is improved very much over time.
I think it's worth saying that, as Emma has pointed out, that increasingly there have been very specific guidelines and instructions for how ethics committees should operate and the consideration that they should take into account. But broadly, their job is to ensure that the participants are exposed to reasonable risks and they're protected, and secondly, that they understand and give valid consent to take part. That's basically their job. Increasingly, they have also taken on their shoulders assessing the scientific validity of the research, and in my view, that's a mistake. But it's important to recognise that although these are called ethics committees, they're really public acceptance committees. They apply ethical guidelines that are prescribed to them, and really are a kind of there is rarely anyone with formal training in academic ethics on such a committee, and there are a broad range of people: theologians, a lawyer, a clinician, a layperson, and they use guidelines that have specified the sorts of things they need to attend to. So while they have become more professional, they started off as a group of friends in an institution who would approve projects within their institution. But they now have moved to being much more tightly regulated and specified, but they operate really in a bureaucratic way to ensure that the research conforms to various guidelines and specifications.
I would want to differ with Julian on the issue of the scientific merit. I actually served on the first ethics committee I served on in the late 80s. And at that point, there was a separate scientific merit committee that looked at any research prior to it coming to the ethics committee. So one had a confidence that someone with expertise had looked at this project. That system seems to not be followed as rigorously anymore, and particularly in a university setting where some quite invasive research can sometimes take place if you have a medical school within the university. And if one has genuine doubts about the ability of a methodology to offer some sort of viable results, I think you have an ethical duty to investigate that, challenge it, and possibly withhold your approval until you are reassured that that's the case. Now, you don't want people overstepping their brief or their expertise, but as you say, the makeup of ethics committees is often people who have an interest in ethics, but are also themselves very experienced researchers, be that qualitative or quantitative in a social scientific way, or medical researchers. And I would say that the very first step towards ensuring that some research is ethical is to ensure that it's not wasting time or resources, and that you will have the real possibility of finding something out as a result of doing it. And if you don't look at methodology, or you are not reassured that someone has carefully looked at methodology, then you have a problem.
Well, I do agree that the scientific methodology of research ought to be scrutinised. It's just that ethics committees are not set up and don't have the sufficient expertise to evaluate that. And I completely agree with you. Expert committees are a very valuable thing. When I was the chair of the DHS Ethics Committee, I would outsource any kind of scientific evaluation to experts. I wouldn't ask our committee to try to evaluate it, but that's not what's happened with ethics committees. They've taken it on their own shoulders to evaluate often very complex methodology. But I agree with you, it needs to be evaluated. It's a question of where and by who.
And then can I, then moving away from ethics committees, and just before we break for lunch, ask you about one further matter. If you have a clinician who is providing treatment to a patient, which is the treatment that they think is the appropriate treatment for that patient, but they want to study the consequences, the side effects, the efficacy of how that treatment is working on a group of their patients, potentially for the purposes of analysing that information and publishing their thoughts. What are the ethical requirements in relation to that kind of undertaking?
This is a particularly tricky problem that Professor Sir Ian Chalmers, who established the Cochrane collaboration, described as the double standard. That if you claim that you've got a new intervention that's going to be better, you can just introduce it without any real constraints. But if you want to measure whether it's working and compare it to what you've been doing, that becomes research and requires the approval of a research ethics committee. So his argument was you're essentially auditing what you're doing and you shouldn't require ethics approval for that. That, however, is not the standard view, that if you're going to publish, if you're going to systematically study this, it constitutes research and needs the approval of a research ethics committee.
And would it be fair to infer from everything else that you said yesterday and today that the patient or patients who are being treated and studied in that way should be made aware of that fact?
I think there can be differences between research and audit and service evaluation. And one of the differences is the proximity to the direct experience of the patient. So if, for example, what we're looking at is a survey of notes every so many months and a collation of information that is then anonymized, that feels somewhat different to a research intervention that is very much going to become part of that person's life. The problem, as Julian, I think, has alluded, is that it's a fuzzy boundary, and there may well be occasions on which we would want to think carefully about the ethical implications of audit or service evaluation. And when we do, there's nowhere to go because the ethics committees have been set up to look at research and they're often overburdened. And if they feel that something is described as audit, they at least have the option of saying that's not our business. So audit, I think, is another very valuable tool in medical, in terms of medical progress. It's about judging whether something one has adopted remains fit for purpose, whether there might be a need for research to start developing it further or even replacing it fully. We want to know by following up and auditing what happens once something that has been subject to research becomes part of standard clinical practice. And for the most part, that won't raise as acute or complex ethical issues as a piece of research, but I think it's important not to be complacent. And where it raises issues about confidentiality or privacy, these sorts of things that are in common with our concerns both in the clinical setting and the research setting, then where does a clinician go for advice on how best to and appropriately to conduct their audit?
I think today, in relation to your question about consent from the patient, if something looks like research, it ought to go to a research ethics committee, and if you don't want to get the patient's consent, that should be approved by the research ethics committee, would be my position on that issue. If it looks vaguely like research, you need at least the approval of the ethics committee, and if you're not going to get consent, they need to have approved that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, the corollary of that is that if something is very clearly part of sort of total quality management or a quality management process, then there doesn't necessarily need to be consent, but there still needs to be information. So patients can be told up front is that during the process of your treatment, your information will be collected, data about outcomes will be collected, it will be reported to the following database, or in the situation that I work in, it'll be reported to the following national and international registries. This is an important part of gaining information about the future. It continues ad nauseum. So there's no one particular research question, but it is gaining knowledge, and it's creating the basis for further research, as Bobby says. But, so it suggests that at the very least, I think there's broad acceptance now that there aren't clear lines between research and audit, and there has to be, upfront thinking about, is there a research question here? Does this, as Julian says, does this look like a piece of research? And if it does, well, then it needs to be turned into a proper piece of research and done properly.
I think the underlying point here is that the definition of research isn't uncontested. There's a grey area between research and audit, between research and compassionate care, between research and compassionate use. So I made the point previously, a few minutes ago, that there was this grey area between research and medical care that was potentially exacerbated by the earlier versions of the Declaration of Helsinki and other guidelines. We've moved to a view now that where the aim is in part a research aim, that the patient should be aware of that fact. But that really wasn't so clear in guidance previously.
So I note the time. I have a few further questions, but also need to afford core participants the opportunity to suggest further questions. Can I invite you to take the lunch break now and to make it an hour and a quarter, because I'm anticipating that there may be quite a few questions from core participants that I'll need to look at over lunch.
There will be. Is there nothing which you are falling over yourself, as it were, to ask Professor Kerridge? Because, of course, we will lose him.
No. I think the one specific question I had for Professor Kerridge has been answered.
Very well.
I'm delighted to hear that.
Well, you never know. If there is a question, we won't let you escape quite that easily. It'll have to come to you for answering probably in writing. I hope
be happy to.
do. Can I just thank you enormously for your contribution to this? It's those of us who are not normally used to going to work between 9 o'clock at night and midnight will fully appreciate and understand what you have done for us. Particularly, I think just after coming back off a break. So thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for your contribution, which has been refreshing. As with everyone else, you haven't been at all hesitant in saying where your views might differ, although broadly they don't. Can I thank you for that?
No, thank you, Sir Brian, and thanks, Julian, Bobby, Emma, and Madeline, and good luck for the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Well, let's then say, shall we, 2:30.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
2:30.